Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today. I'm Evan Pundyke. I'm the marketing director here at Arrive Logistics, and we're really excited to have you all join us. I'm going to take a quick minute and talk about Arrive just because I'm in marketing and that's what I do. But we're really not trying to make this about us. We're really excited just to bring some value to our transportation partners, and really excited to have you guys join us on the call. So we're a 3-year-old company. We turned 3 on the 14th. In the last 3 years, we've accomplished a lot. We've grown from 10 employees to over 230. We've got over 1,000 active customers. We're projected to move 100,000 loads and have 120 million in revenue. So it's an exciting time here at Arrive. And I also wanted to mention that on your side, you've got a chat feature. So if you are having maybe issues with the sound or anything that you want to comment, feel free to do that, and I'll be on the other end of that. And we also have a question and answer feature. So please, I encourage you to ask lots of questions. This is a really interesting topic, and we've had a lot of really good questions that John has done a great job answering, and he's going to do that at the end. So I'll hand it on over. Thanks so much.
All right, so hey, thanks for coming to our webinar. We're excited to have you here. I'm going to kind of give you a breakdown about what to expect over the next hour. We're going to go about 45 or 50 minutes as a whole. I'm going to start giving you a little background on me, and then we'll go into the presentation. So my name's John Seidl. I was a State Patrol inspector for about 12 years with the Wisconsin State Patrol. Then I was an investigator with the federal government for about, 8, 9 years. So total of 20 years experience in DOT compliance as it relates to a truck driver and a motor carrier. After I left FMCSA, I became a hazmat specialist with the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, and I did that for about 3 years. So about 23 years experience in the DOT realm doing regulatory compliance. So enough about me. Let's just get started into the webinar. Why this matters. Why is this important, right? So you came into this webinar with a certain level of knowledge. We're hoping that you leave 45, 50 minutes from now, and then with some question and answer after that, with more knowledge than when you came in. And then we challenge you to take that knowledge and bring it back to your company to improve operational efficiencies, change some safety culture at your company. Basically, prepare yourself and reduce possible liability going forward. So those are things that we think are really important. The other piece, though, is with a company culture, safety is always a component at a shipper receiver with warehouse and loading and unloading, et cetera. Well, trucking companies have safety in mind as well. And I think shippers and receivers play a big role in truck driver and trucking company safety. So when you think of the logistics chain, you've got drivers, you got motor carriers, brokers, receivers, and shippers. And if you take all those stakeholders, we ultimately want to make improvements across the board with all of them. So why this matters? Reduce crashes and save lives, right? From a truck driver perspective, we want to reduce crashes and save lives. We want to promote safety with this entire logistics chain. We don't want to be a part of the problem, right? So with this particular driver, he drove 9 hours over federal rules. His logbook was false, and they determined he was over hours. Now, when you think about that, 9 hours over federal rules, a lot of people think that's a lot. I've done driver meetings in the past, and ultimately, I've asked the drivers, hey, who thinks 9 hours over federal rules is a lot? The drivers will raise their hand like, yeah, that's a lot of time over the federal rules. Then I say, okay, well, take it from this perspective. Let's say that you have a 14-hour period in which you can work, and you can drive 11 hours in the 14-hour period. That's standard hours of service for a truck driver. Then he needs to take 10 hours off. Then he can start another 14-hour period with 11 hours of driving. Well, I asked the same drivers at the driver meeting, I said, hey, have you ever shortchanged your 10-hour break? Have you ever said, hey, it's a 10-hour break in my paper log, but in reality, it was only 8 hours or maybe 9 hours? And the driver's like, yep, I've done that. So then I remind them, hey, if you drive 11 hours today and you only take 8 hours off, you said it's 10, that's a false log. And if you only take 8 hours off when it's supposed to be 10, and then you drive 11 hours the next day, in reality, what you have is you have 11-hour workday. You don't have 10 hours off. Then you have another 11-hour workday. If you crash at the end of the second day, you're 11 hours over federal rules. So in perspective, that doesn't make this seem so bad. So now when you talk about truck drivers as well, I want you to challenge yourself when you're listening to me, thinking on this call. Name me jobs where you have other people's lives in the palm of your hand. Truck driver comes to mind, pilot, doctor, police, firefighter, military, like a vessel captain. You know, if you start brainstorming, you'll maybe come to like 12, 15 jobs. But think of a truck driver, life in the palm of their hands. Now, of those jobs, who goes to jail if they don't do their job right? Truck driver, maybe police, military, maybe a doctor. So to bring it all home, what you have is you have a professional truck driver. He's someone who has someone's life in the palm of his hand. And if he doesn't do his job right, he goes to jail, right? So what happened in this situation? Him being false and over hours, 1 second of him falling asleep, and we will suffer the rest of our lives. That's a family. I don't want you to look at the ELD as something that affects capacity right now. I don't want you to think about how's it going to affect rates. Are we going to be able to make money? I want you to think that the ELD is a safety regulation that's trying to make it so these drivers can operate reasonable hours within their workday, not have to falsify, and in the end, they can save lives, right? Spencer, this driver, pleaded guilty, was sentenced to an 8-year prison sentence, of which 4 hours were suspended. So now we're going to get into the meat of the presentation, but I wanted to make sure we don't lose sight as to why ELDs were even developed. So now let's get into the history, right? In order to make educated decisions as to where this industry is going with ELDs, you have to understand where we came from. So where did ELDs originate from? What was the year that they started? We're going to talk about that as part of the history. Then we're going to talk about who's subject. If you think about this, we know tractor trailers are subject to this rule. But how far does it go? Does it go down to landscapers and construction workers and passengers? And what size vehicle are we talking about? We're going to talk about that as well. The coercion rule. Okay, the coercion rule is unprecedented. Coercion rule is something interesting. It's the first time in the history of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations where an investigator from FMCSA responding to a complaint by a driver can reach out to a shipper and receiver and potentially hold them accountable and liable for actions that they do or don't do as it relates to the coercion rule. We're going to talk about the details on that. Now, how do ELDs work? ELDs, everybody can spell ELDs, you spell it ELD, that's a joke, but ultimately electronic logging devices is what they're called. But do you know how they work? Do you know how a driver interacts? Do you know how a carrier interacts? Do you know how it can increase their operational efficiencies? How a driver can possibly falsify them? We're going to talk about that too. The ELD rule on a PDF that I have on my computer, it's 162 pages long. Now, I'm not going to sit here over the next 45, 50 minutes and talk about the ELD rule as a whole. I'm going to direct the things in the rule that apply to shippers and receivers so then you have a better understanding. CSA is how companies are rated by the government to determine who gets a visit from the government, not. So if you have company A with elevated CSA scores, company B with lower CSA scores, the government is going to do a review of the company with elevated CSA scores. They're also going to do a review at companies that have a complaint that's documented by the federal government, and they're going to do reviews if there's a fatality or a high-profile incident. The next tab we're going to talk about is what can your freight broker do for you? What can your freight broker do for you? Well, this is an example of what we can do for you. We can educate you on the ELD, on the coercion rule, where we stand as an industry, and give you suggestions about how we can reduce liability going forward from a broker perspective. And then the next step is on you. If we educate you on all this stuff, which we're going to do today, what can you do as a shipper to improve the entire logistics chain, right? And then we're going to get into the next steps. Where do we go from here? So, history of the ELD rulemaking. 1988. What did the internet sound like in 1988? Now, some of you younger people out there might be like, what's this dude talking about? Some of the older people realize that's what the internet sounded like in 1988. Well, what also happened in 1988 is they wrote the current rule for computers tracking driver hours of service. And that current rule is called automatic onboard recording devices. Automatic onboard recording devices are devices that have been in existence basically since 1988 and progressed in technology as the years have gone by. But this is a voluntary device. It's not mandatory. So then you fast forward 19 years later, and the federal government proposed a rule called EOBR1. EOBR1 was new technology. EOBR1 were new devices that were going to be mandated for companies that ended up with an adverse rating during a federal government visit where they came and knocked on the door. Adverse rating is a conditional rating or an unsatisfactory rating. So in 2007, the federal government was going to phase in new technology for tracking hours of service called EOBR for the quote-unquote bad carriers. Then 3 years later is when EOBR 1 finally became a rule. So it took 3 more years. If you do the math, that's 22 years it took to go from an AOBRD final rule to an EOBR final rule. So then the government immediately went into EOBR 2. They said, we're going to mandate these EOBR 1 devices for every company in the country, not just the ones with bad ratings. So then that was proposed in 2011. Right in the middle, though, OIDA sued the government over driver harassment when they developed EOBR 1. They brought it to the 7th Appeals Court. 7th Appeals Court agreed and threw EOBR 1 in the garbage. Now, they didn't literally throw it in the garbage, but they ended up throwing it away and saying this is no longer an effective final rule. Well, now we have a problem. EOBR 1 is mandating the technical specifications of EOBR. EOBR 2 is mandating the technical specifications in EOBR 1. But now this is a vacated rule. So now you're going to mandate something that got vacated. That doesn't work. So the government became trash pickers. They went over in 2012 and they grabbed EOBR 1 and EOBR 2 out of the garbage, did a supplemental notice of proposed rulemaking, and then that turned into ELDs. Well, how did the term go from EOBRs to ELDs? Well, that's interesting in the history lesson. Right in here, MAP 21, if you've heard about that, that's when brokers went from a $10,000 surety bond to a $75,000. Congress got involved because it took too long. It was taking too long to get this mandate in place. So they attached FMCSA, a requirement to put ELDs into place in the near future, because they didn't understand why the delay was occurring. Well, at the same time, Congress changed the name from EOBRs to ELDs. ELDs are electronic logging device, which is pretty funny because electronic logging devices, if you take the term literally, could be a chainsaw. That's a joke too. But ultimately, ELDs were proposed as ELDs in 2014 with a comment period. And finally, in 2015, the mandate's here. Now, what has occurred over the last couple days? The next version of MAP 21 called THUD, an appropriations bill, the Transportation Committee added a rider to that bill, that appropriations bill, to try to get a delay or a suspension of the ELD mandate. And that was 2 days ago. Yesterday, they added a bill to, a bill proposal to get rid of the mandate for the next 2 years, to delay it until 2019. So there's been a lot of press out there in the last few days about where this is going. But as of right now, the mandate is still in effect. I'm going to show you on the next slide the dates of it, but just be advised that there is some traction in Congress, and I can't estimate what's going to happen with it. But a lot of our presentation here still applies because the coercion rule and other things are basically still out there, and whether there's a mandate or not, they're still going to be applicable. All right, so now where are we at with dates? 2017. By 2017, this December, every company out there that's subject to the rule is either going to have to install an AOBRD or an ELD. They have to install one or the other by this December. If they don't install one or the other by this December, then they're going to be subject to roadside inspections and compliance reviews by the government, etc. Now, 2019, you fast forward under the current rule as it's written today, AOBRDs and ELDs can be used up until 2019. Once 2019 hits, AOBRDs are no longer allowed. Everything has to be an ELD. Now, there are AOBRDs out there that have hardware specifications that will meet the ELD. They just haven't done that last software update. So there are some AOBRDs that can convert to ELDs, but there's some AOBRDs that are no longer going to exist. But ultimately, you need something in your truck by this December, and then that something cannot be an AOBRD after 2019. Now, what vehicles are subject? The reason I have a dually pickup truck that's around 10,000 pounds is because if you look inside this door, it's got a gross vehicle weight rating. The gross vehicle weight rating of a dually pickup truck is generally over 10,000 pounds. If you're 10,001 pounds or more GVWR or actual weight with the freight in the back, you need an ELD for this truck operating in interstate commerce unless you meet an exception. Now, we know tractor trailer needs this, but I don't know if everybody realized that it really goes down to vehicles as small as this operating in interstate commerce, including construction companies, passenger companies, landscapers, and for-hire trucking companies. So that's kind of where we are with the history and an applicability. Now we're going to go into the exceptions. I said everybody with a dually pickup truck or higher operating in interstate commerce needs an ELD by December unless accepted. So here's one of the major exceptions. If you have a CDL vehicle is an example, and that vehicle meets these that driver meets these 5 questions. So a CDL vehicle with a driver that meets these 5 questions, you do not need a logbook today. Meaning if you are filling out paper logs, you don't have to fill out a paper logbook if you meet what's called the 100 air mile radius exception. So number 1, stay within 100 air miles. Number 2, leave and return to the same spot and go home in 12 hours. Number 3, get 10 hours off between these 12-hour days. Don't exceed more than 11 hours driving in this 12-hour period, which I find pretty funny, because how are you ever going to drive more than 11 in a 12-hour period when you have to stay within 100 air miles unless you're just driving around in circles? So the last one is true and accurate time records. Do you have time records showing time start, time finished, total hours worked? Now, if a driver answers all 5 of these questions correctly, they answer all 5 correctly, they do not need a logbook. If you answer any one of these 5 questions incorrectly, you need a logbook for this day. So let's say a driver asks these questions over a 30-day period, as you can see down here, and they needed a logbook 5 days. Well, 5 days is 8 or less. That means they're exempt from the ELD. Now let's say another 30-day period. The driver needed a logbook for 7 days. That's 8 or less, so you're exempt from an ELD. But another 30-day period, 10 days, they answered these questions wrong. That means you need a logbook for the entire 30 days, an ELD, because you answered these questions wrong 9 or more times. So this is called the 100 air mile radius exception. For non-CDL vehicles, there's a few different questions, but this just gives you an idea. They're called short haul exemptions. Now the next exception is brand new trucks. This is a brand new truck. This is a brand new truck, this is a brand new truck. Why should you put an ELD in a brand new truck that you're delivering, and when you deliver it, you got to yank the ELD out? So the government gave an exception to drive away, tow away, because it's the delivery of brand new vehicles. The third exception as of now is 99 model year or older. If you have a 99 or older model year truck, you're exempt from the ELD mandate. The reason they did this is ELDs connect to the engine. And some of the engine plugs for the ECM have different output data, and some of the vendors can't configure their device to take all the data from older vehicles and grab the data and make the ELD work. So instead of the government saying this model and this year and this make and this size, etc., they just drew a line in the sand and saying anything older than 2000, meaning 99 or older model year, is exempt from the ELD. I chuckle at this, but after you get off this presentation, go to Google and search a truck that's a 1999 with a sleeper, and then try to buy a truck that's a 2000 with a sleeper and see what the difference in price is. Don't be surprised if you find 99 sleeper berth trucks selling for larger prices than 2001s and 2002s. And you can kind of infer as to why that is. You lose the fudge factor regarding logs, meaning you lose the ability to falsify your log with ELDs to the level that you could with hours of service with paper logs. So now, before we get into this coercion rule, I have to explain 2 instances. 2 instances where you can drive your vehicle, actually drive the vehicle without it going onto the driving line. So the driving line is line 3 of the logbook. With an ELD, the device is connected to the engine, and when you step on the gas, it puts you on the line 3 of the driving. If you have authorized personal conveyance, you can drive the vehicle off duty. Now, this has been in the regulatory guidance for years and years and years, but drivers with paper logs never really asked a lot of questions about it because they would just falsify and cover up whatever they were doing, right? Drivers with AOBRDs and ELDs now ask this question all the time. So we're going to talk about 3 criteria that you need to meet in order to have personal conveyance. The first one is your company has to be relieved from work and all responsibility for performing work. The next one is your company has to go your driver has to go short distances, and then the driver may not operate laden, meaning you can't have freight in the vehicle. You have to be unladen in your CMV. So we'll recap. To drive while off duty using personal conveyance, you got to be relieved of all responsibility for performing work. You have to go short distances, and you may not operate a loaded CMV. It has to be unloaded. One last thing though, we go to short distance. It's not defined in the regulations. 15 minutes, a half an hour, maybe an hour is acceptable, but FMCSA has not put out distinct, legitimate, direct guidance as to how long, from a time perspective or from a mile perspective, how far short distance should be. The next one is yard miles. Now, yard miles doesn't affect the coercion rule as much. It just affects whether you want to be a shipper or receiver of choice, right? So ultimately, what is a yard mile? A yard mile is where you can drive your truck without being in the driving line instead of being off duty, which that's not yard miles. Yard miles is driving while on duty, not driving. Now, how can you drive while on duty, not driving? Well, you can do it if you qualify for yard miles. Now, what are yard miles? Yard miles is driving on a non-highway. I'll say it again, driving on a non-highway. You cannot use yard miles on a highway. You can only use yard miles on a non-highway. So now you have to understand, well, what's a highway, right? Well, if you use your own intellect and your own common sense, you think a highway is like an interstate, a road, a street. Well, you're kind of close. A highway is a road or a street, but it's also a way. A way? A way that is on public or private property. Private property? You can have a highway according to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations on private property, and the answer is yes. So any way on private property that's passable by four-wheel standard passenger cars is a potential highway. The last caveat to this is it open to public travel. Well, that means general public use without restrictive gates or prohibitive signs. Now let's take a shipper location. Let's say you have a shipper and they got a fence around the whole yard, and they have a gate shack where trucks come in and out and passenger cars can't come in because it's restricted via gate. Well, then that's not a highway. Sure, there's a way back there and it's private property and it's certainly passable by four-wheel standard cars, but it is not a highway because it has restrictive gates. Now let's say you're a shipper receiver and you have a yard behind your building, but there's no fence and there's no gate. Do you have prohibitive signs prominently displayed keeping out the public? If you do, you can turn that lot into a yard. The reason the driver needs it is if he's at 11 hours and he doesn't want to use up his driving time, but he has more time towards his 14, that extra 3 hours, he can legitimately use yard miles. So you placing or not placing strategic, prominently displayed prohibitive signs at your locations to public access could make the difference in whether a driver is over hours or not. So do you want to be the best shipper in class? Do you want to be a shipper of choice? Add flexibility for the driver so that he can do things to increase his capacity and increase his availability to do the job. So now one last thing before we get into the coercion rule. We talked about short distance. FMCSA was asked by commenters, we want clear-cut limits and mileage and time thresholds for yard moves and personal conveyance. The government, FMCSA, said, no, the agency does not think it's appropriate to include these definitions in the ELD rulemaking. Therefore, we, FMCSA, are declining to address these matters at this time. I used to work at FMCSA. I've been hearing for well over a decade that they're going to give more clear and concise personal conveyance guidance, and it hasn't happened yet. So where are we at now? Harassment. Harassment was what needed to be addressed in the EOBR rule, which caused it to be vacated, which turned it into the ELD rule under MAP 21. So now it's ELD. They added a bunch of stuff regarding driver harassment. And in the ELD rule, motor carriers are prohibited from harassing drivers. Drivers have the ability to mute the motor carrier from communicating to them in the device. That's just one example of harassment I wanted to show you from the mandate. But now we're getting into the coercion rule. Does the coercion rule have anything directly correlated to the ELD mandate? The answer is no. Coercion rule was put into effect January 29, 2016. It is final already. There's no phase-in time. You can be held accountable for the coercion rule right now. ELD mandate doesn't come into effect till this December. They're completely separate rules. And right now, the coercion rule reaches out to motor carriers. Well, surprise, surprise, that FMCSA adopted a regulation that would reach out to drivers and carriers. But what else did they do? They actually wrote in shippers, receivers, and transportation intermediaries. That means that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration can follow up on a complaint from a driver if he feels he was coerced and we meet the coercion rule. They can follow up with a shipper, a receiver, or transportation intermediary and hold them accountable for their actions if they coerce a driver. Unprecedented. I've never seen it where FMCSA may go investigate a shipper to apply the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations to things they did or didn't do. So now I'm going to give you some definitions. Then we're going to go into a real life example of the coercion rule that every shipper and receiver in the country is potentially subject to. A receiver is someone who takes delivery of product. A shipper is someone who tenders it. Transportation intermediary is someone who arranges it. That's a broker. And I'll tell you, Arrive Logistics here has already put policies in place to mitigate, meaning reduce the likelihood of liability as it relates to the coercion rule, because they're as much subject to it as you are. So coercion prohibited. No motor carrier, which we discussed before, but no shipper, receiver, or broker can coerce a driver into violating any Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulation. If a driver feels that a motor carrier or shipper, receiver, broker has coerced them, they may file a written complaint to the federal government. However, a shipper, receiver, or broker cannot be found guilty of committing coercion or found liable of it unless the driver puts them on notice when it's occurring. So if the driver objects at the time that they're being coerced, puts that entity on notice, and they fail to heed, they use the word heed to the objection in the rule, that person or entity may have committed coercion under the coercion rule. So now let's take an example. We're going to talk about a good shipper receiver and one that isn't so good, right? The first shipper receiver tells a driver, hey, I want you here at the 12th hour. You need to get here at this time, which is the driver's 12th hour. He gets there on time, on the time that you gave him to be there. And when he gets there, you're a good shipper, so you load him in an hour. Then he leaves at the 13th hour and drives a half an hour to the truck stop. So he's now from 12 loaded to 13, a half an hour to the truck stop, 13 and a half. He's still within his 14-hour rule. You are a shipper of choice. You gave him a time. He got there at the time. He had an hour loading. He drove for half an hour. He goes to the truck stop, spends his 10-hour break, and delivers your freight legally. Perfect. If everybody in the country was like that, we wouldn't even be talking about the coercion rule here probably. So now the next shipper, driver gets there at the 12th hour, but they don't unload him for 5 hours. So he get there at the 12th hour, 5 hours later, it's now the 17th hour, and that shipper says, hey, you're loaded, you need to leave. And the driver says, hey, I can't leave. I'm at my 17th hour. I'm 3 hours over my 14th. I'm on a 5-hour break already. I only need 5 hours and then I can leave. And the shipper says, you know what? You're loaded. We don't want you here no more. Go. Your problem is not my problem. Your problem is between you, the motor carrier. Heck, you can even complain to the broker. I don't care, right? So if a shipper said that to him, the driver says, listen, I object. I'm putting you on notice that I'm going to be over hours if I leave. That shipper has to heed to his objection. Now, why is he over hours? Because he's at the 17-hour mark with a 5-hour break. He now has to drive loaded for 30 minutes to the truck stop. Can he use personal conveyance? No, he's loaded. You can't use personal conveyance when you're loaded. So then he goes a half an hour, then he needs to take 10 full hours off to restart his clock in order to get back legal again. Or he could do something called splitting the sleeper. Without getting too technical, he can take 8 and add it to 2 of the 5. He can take 8 in the sleeper berth, add it to 2. Now he still loses this 3 hours of work opportunity. So if he takes 10 off, he loses the whole 5. If he takes 8 and takes 2 of them to get 10, he still loses these 3 hours. So now let's go to this. It says, has the shipper made a threat to the driver that you need to leave my facility and I don't care that you're putting me on notice. I don't care that you're over hours. It's not my problem. Little does the shipper know, under the coercion rule, it potentially is their problem, right? So did they withhold business or work opportunity from the driver? They withheld work opportunity because that driver either lost 5 hours of work opportunity or 3 because he was forced to leave and had to restart his clock. So ultimately, are we trying to scare you with this? No. what we're trying to do between Arrive and me is educate you on the coercion rules so you understand what potential liability you face, and then we're going to come up with suggestions on how to improve. We're not just going to tell you what the problem is, we're going to try to give you solutions during this webinar. So what can you do to protect your company from the coercion rule? Now I'm going to say it again. If this ELD mandate gets delayed, the coercion rule can still be applied with paper logs. You can still tell a driver to exceed hours of service. Just because he has a paper log or an ELD makes no difference, right? So what do receivers do? Receivers are lucky. They're in a better position. A receiver comes and the driver's loaded. Then he unloads at a receiver and he leaves empty. So let's say he gets there at the 12th hour. Now it's the 17th hour, and then he needs to leave because you're making him leave, which I don't even suggest receivers should make him leave. Let him stay if he can, right? But now he's going to be leaving to go to a truck stop. He got 5 hours. Can he use personal conveyance? Yes, potentially. Does he relieve the responsibility for performing work? Is he going a short distance? Yes, a half an hour at a truck stop. Is he unladen? Yeah, he doesn't have any freight in that trailer in the furtherance of any business. Is he going to local lodging or restaurants in the vicinity? Yeah, he's going to the truck stop. So receivers are in a better place. Shippers, not so much. A shipper at the fifth hour, at the 17th hour, he's loaded. That goes back to what we just said. So if you have a loaded driver over hours, you're going to have to try to accommodate him. And that's a theme of what we're talking about. Why don't we try to accommodate drivers? Here's one way you can do it. Do you have a location where he can drop that loaded trailer, or you can leave it at the dock, or you can have a yard truck push it over and store it over there in your secured facility? The driver can then leave bobtail. If he leaves bobtail, right, he doesn't have any freight. He could actually use personal conveyance because he's bobtailing, short distance, relieved of work, bobtail to the truck stop. Then he can come back 5 hours later, pick up the trailer, and then proceed down the road. And he will not have lost this 5 hours because bobtailing can be off-duty driving under personal conveyance. So that's one option. Another one is let him do his whole break there. If you think about this scenario, he needs a 10-hour break. You already held him up 5 hours, so why not just let him stay 5? He's either been sleeping in his bunk for 5 hours on your lot, or he's been sitting in the break room or reading a book under a tree. He's been doing something for 5 hours. Weren't you liable during that 5 hours? Isn't that liability any different than what it is now that he's loaded? Why don't you just pretend that it took 10 hours to load him and let him stay there the whole time, right? You're doing him a favor to hold him up 10 hours instead of forcing them to leave at 5, right? So can you just let him continue his break there? I don't know why shippers are so reluctant to do that in this country, right? But let's say you won't. I don't want you to drop your trailer. I don't want you to finish your rest break here. You need to leave. If he's loaded, be careful, because if he files a complaint, I don't know how you defend that, right? Another option, check available hours of service as they enter your facility. A lot of these locations, we write down the truck number and the company number and all this stuff, and we can put all these columns on there. Why don't we add a column that says how many hours available? You can ask the driver. Let's say he says he has 3 hours left. You hold him up for 5. Then later he claims coercion. Man, he's still within his hours of service, but you documented that so you can defend yourself, right? So why else would you ask for his hours? It allows you to work with the driver. Knowing his available hours increases operational efficiencies for everybody involved. The driver, the trucking company, the broker, you, the shipper and receiver. You'll all run more efficient. You won't hold the driver up and then force him to leave over hours. Now, could you turn him away? Of course you can. Let's say the driver comes in and you ask him and you look at his display and it says he's at 13 and a half hours and he's going to get loaded. And if he gets loaded at your facility, you ain't dropping a trailer here and you're not getting your rest break here. If you can't accommodate the driver at your facility and he's there at the 13 and a half hour mark, don't take the approach, hey, this isn't my problem. What I would do is turn him away. Turn him away and say, listen, you need a 10-hour break anyway, and I don't want you taking it here. So you need to go to that truck stop a half an hour up the road, and we'll see you in 10, 11 hours from now. Half an hour to the truck stop, 10 hours off, half an hour back. We'll see you in about 11, 11:15, right? That's how many hours until you can return. All of this stuff is you being a proactive shipper or receiver, accommodating a driver to make everything more streamlined, to make you a shipper of choice. But what all this does too is it reduces your exposure to the coercion rule. So now we talk about ELDs. How do they work? This is one of the more predominant ELDs in the country. This is a cord that connects to the engine of the truck. The driver logs into this, goes, boom, I'm logged in, right? Now this device knows the driver's driving. It also grabs GPS location. So if he's logged in and the engine is giving information to this and it's capturing GPS information, then it's working properly. So now if a driver steps on the gas, the engine will put him in driving line. Once the vehicle exceeds 5 miles an hour, it automatically puts him in the driving line. With a paper log, how is he in the driving line? He just grabs a piece of paper and draws driving, right? Now, who dictates how much driving he did? Whatever the dude wants to write in the logbook is what he can write. He's supposed to tell the truth, but that isn't always the case. So if this is working right, we know that if he's supposed to drive 11, he's driving 11, right? So ultimately, it keeps track, and an absolute is, this is how much driving you have. Then every change of duty status, it pings the location, and every hour it pings the location. So we also know exactly where he is. So the absolutes with an ELD is, when are you driving? When are you not driving? And where are you when you're doing these activities? Now, non-driving activities are sleeper berth, off duty, or on duty, not driving. That's no different than a paper log, because you can still falsify those 3 levels. The ELD was never designed to be a full sure system where all 4 duty statuses are automatically recorded, because you can't. How's the device supposed to know if the driver's sitting under a tree reading a book off duty, or if he's fueling a truck, which is required to be on duty? It doesn't. So now this log is end up sent to the motor carrier interface, and then this interface has asset tracking, hours of service tracking, increased operational efficiencies as you go through this, right? Now, can you falsify these? Yeah. Is it legal? No. So let's say the driver's logged in and he hits Indianapolis. He hits Indianapolis as his 14th hour, but he has a delivery in Chicago. So he drives 4 more hours to Chicago, then he delivers, then he sleeps for 6, then he logs back in. He'll log off duty in Indianapolis. 10 hours later, it'll show him logging back on duty in Chicago. Too bad the locations don't match. He went off duty in Indianapolis, woke up in Chicago with no driving. But if you don't check the city and states, you'll end up not finding this false. But with ELDs, it'll list all those trips where the driver logged off and drove right on the device. Or these systems send it to the company so they can track a list of all the device log-offs and driving. It's called the unidentified driver profile. And a lot of good legitimate companies will monitor that and put an end to it. So then drivers are not allowed to log off and drive to circumvent their onboard recorder. So now they have a list of certified ELDs. The certified ELD list is buyer beware. Vendors themselves say, I'm an ELD. They sign up and say, hey, my device is an ELD. Take a few pictures of it, send the manual, FMCSA approves it. I can tell you right now with confidence that I am aware of a vendor, I'm not saying how many, but I know of one that does not meet this ELD rule because of a roadside inspection I'm aware of and the interface that I looked at. They don't meet all the requirements, but they already self-certified. The government is not vetting through these devices. They're just accepting what the vendor says. So now what's this book? This is an out-of-service criteria book. This comes out every April 2017 by CVSA, nonprofit organization that outlines out-of-service at roadside. Every state patrol squad in the country has this book. In April of this year, they came out with all of these situations where an ELD is going to be placed out of service for 10 hours or longer. So effective December of this year, any driver or carrier using an ELD that's not on that self-certified list. Hard to enforce that because you need an ELD or an AOBRD. So if the ELD isn't on the list, then it by default might be an AOBRD. So you really can't enforce that per se. There are circumstances where you can, but this is absolutely 100% enforceable in December 2019 when there are no more AOBRDs. Drivers unable to transfer a data file. In an onboard recorder, you have to be able to move a data file out of the onboard recorder to the officer's computer so he can log in and look at the driver logs right on his computer. If a driver has an ELD, he's logged in, it's working right, everything's accurate, he's within his hours, but the officer says, hey, transfer the data file, and the driver's like, I don't know how to do that. he's out of service for 10 hours. Using an accepted category that you don't meet. Failure to reconstruct logs that malfunction. Failure to repair an ELD in 8 days, all out of service. Failure to log into it. That's the Indiana-Chicago thing, which will produce a false log, having a false log. Driver required to have an ELD, but it's not equipped with one. Pull over a driver and I'm like, hey dude, where's your ELD? He's like, I'm anti-government, man. I didn't want to put one in. And then you say, well, you're out of service for 10 hours and you have to bring a vendor out or some kind of person, and they have to install one here at the scale before you can leave. What? You have to install it at the scale? It's just like a tire. You get to a scale with a bald tire, you need a new tire. You go to the scale without an ELD, better install an ELD. So now those are out of service violations. What are the most common roadside violations in the history of computers that track hours of service? An instruction card and a blank set of logs. You need to provide an instruction card to explain how to operate the device. You need a blank set of logs in case the device fails, right? So this is an interesting example from last week. This is a company with 500 trucks that clearly has AOBRDs in their truck. The reason I say they clearly have them over a 2-year period is look at all these violations and look at 395.15, 395.15, 395.15. These are sites for onboard recorders. So instruction card, form and manner, and blank set of logs, right? This company, the majority of their violations are all AOBRD related. Now we go to the next one, and it's a company with 150 trucks. This is last week, so I can tell you this company with pretty good certainty has not put one in, at least in the last 6 months or so, because you'd see some violations. You'd see these type of violations reduced. They wouldn't have so many of them. They certainly wouldn't have 12 false logs like this company only has 1, right? And no AOBRD violation. So I'm pretty confident this one doesn't have it. How does that affect the broker and what we're doing? We can monitor CSA scores and with some certainty make a determination whether some of these carriers that have claimed to have ELDs or AOBRDs, whether they have them or don't, right? So now what can your broker do for you? Arrive and other brokers have a broker carrier contract that includes a clause requiring AOBRDs and ELDs. Verify, ask them, hey, how many do you have? And how long do you plan on getting the rest of them? But instead of just taking their word for it, those last 2 slides showed clearly that CSA data can dictate whether or not there's onboard related violations and give you an idea of whether they have them installed. This 4th bullet I love. I love it because we're providing training right now for shippers and receivers to increase operational efficiencies, reduce liability, reduce crashes, and save lives as we work with the driver and the motor carriers, accommodating them as they come in and out of our facility. Now, we're not just stopping there with Arrive Logistics. We're going to our broker staff. We're going to our motor carriers and all of our drivers, and we're making sure everybody can put stuff into place to make this entire logistics chain from drivers to motor carriers to brokers to shippers to retrievers run more smoothly. We need to work together as a team. We need to stop working against each other in one sense by holding folks up. Provide stakeholders with continued resource to assist with future ELD questions. That is having a guy like me around to help with specific ELD questions. But if I train the broker staff, just talking to your Arrive staff to see how well your knowledge level as it relates to that. Ensure each driver has adequate hours. A lot of dispatches ask if they have adequate hours. But what we're doing is one step more, is we're determining parking and drop locations, which includes building a database of those parking and drop locations. So if we have a driver that says, hey, I'm not going to be able to get there to the 13.5-hour mark to load at this shipper, we're going to say, that's okay, because this shipper has the ability to take your 10-hour break there, or they'll let you back up the trailer to the dock. They'll let you bobtail to the truck stop. They'll just move your trailer with a spotter truck in the yard and move it over, right? So that's adding flexibility. That's accommodating a driver. And that's the kind of stuff your broker should be doing for you, right? Now, become a shipper of choice. We're going back to this, 14-hour. You have a 14-hour period as a driver. 14-hour period right here as a driver, which includes all his work, including driving. Well, he can only drive 11 hours in this 14-hour period. So what's 14 minus 11? 14 minus 11 is 3. So that gives the driver 3 hours of non-driving per day for the entire 14-hour period, right? Now, in that non-driving of 3 hours, 30 minutes has to be a break mandated by the government taken at or before the 8th hour of that 14-hour day before he can drive again. So now when we think about that, a driver starts at 6 a.m. He ends at 8 p.m. That's a 14-hour period. I'm guessing people on the call are not working 6 a.m. to 8 p.m. today, because I know I'm not, and I know Evan's not. You know, we're not working 14-hour days today, but in a driver's day, it's a 14-hour day, and that would be legal, right? So between 6 and 8 p.m., doesn't he have to go to the bathroom? Doesn't he have to eat? Doesn't he have to stretch his legs? He might need to take care of some personal business, right? Respond to some emails from home. So some of this 3 hours he needs for himself. 30 is a break. The rest of it is left for shippers and receivers to unload and load him timely. Every minute over 3 hours is a minute taken away from his driving. Last time I checked, drivers get paid by the mile. You can't get miles unless you're driving. So your tires have to spin around in circles going down the road to make money, right? So let's say a shipper holds a driver up in the middle of the day for 5 hours. That means they just exceeded this 3 as a whole because of one delay. So now let's say the driver, that's his only delay of the day. He used it as his 30-minute break. He used it to do all his business. He ate 2 meals during it. He did all that. So now he only can drive 9. He can only drive 9 hours because 5 hours is his break. 9 plus 5 is 14, right? But the driver doesn't want to lose that 2 hours. So what does he do? He still drives 11. He just said his workday was 14. He shortens your 5-hour break to 3, says he drove, took 3 at your place, drove, hits his 14-hour, has his 11, but that's not the truth. That's a false log. His day was really 16 hours long with 11 of driving. And the only reason it went to 16 is because he was delayed 5 hours. That is not fair to a driver, but he feels compelled to falsify so he can still make his money, right? So what else can you do? Accommodate the driver. How about we develop policies and procedures that are called driver accommodation procedures? I've never seen it, but wouldn't it be nice to train warehouse staff to accommodate drivers? It improves your reputation amongst the logistics community, which will only help you. You will be a shipper and receiver that motor carriers and drivers want to work for, thus increasing your overall capacity and controlling rates. And I'll tell you, we'll get into this in the last slide about controlling rates and your capacity as a shipper of choice. But what does it also do? All this stuff that the broker's doing, that the shipper's doing, is ultimately going to reduce that coercion rule exposure. I don't know about you, but I don't want the government coming and knocking on my door. I used to knock on company doors, and I had companies tell me, I didn't sleep at all last night. It's a stressful thing. And I don't know any shipper and receiver that wants FMCSA knocking at your door, that's for sure, right? So now as a recap, we'll do this like, 3-4 minutes, we'll be done. All right, so history. 1988, EOBR 1, EOBR 2, they added them together. MAP 21 changed it to ELDs, Congress got involved. 2014, ELD proposed rule. 2015 mandate. Last week, we've got a rider on an appropriations bill. We've got a new independent bill that's going to delay it for 2 years. Neither one of those is in effect. Are they going to become effect? It's only a delay anyway. Why don't you just put the devices in the truck and let's move on to the next century, right? So, so these are things that we've learned from the history. Who's subject? I'll tell you, a dually pickup truck with a 5th wheel with lawnmowers on it crossing the line between Wisconsin down into Chicago to cut grass. If it's a CDL truck and they're doing 13-hour work days, they don't meet the 100 air mile radius exemption. They need an ELD and a dually pickup truck pulling a trailer with a bunch of lawnmowers on it, cutting grass all within 50 miles under this rule. So don't think it's just tractor trailers with brokers and freight brokers. It's a bunch of people involved in this, right? So coercion rule. I think we've covered a lot of elements of the coercion rule. We didn't want to scare you. What we wanted to do is make you understand that there's a rule out there from January 2016, and whether ELDs get pushed back or not, you can be liable under the coercion rule with a driver that shows up with a paper log, because you're still forcing them over hours. Nowhere in the coercion rule does it say if he shows up with an ELD, you're liable for the coercion rule. It doesn't say that. So how ELDs work? You know how a driver logs in, you know how he logs off, you know how he can falsify them, you know how it's connected to the engine, captures satellite, sends the whole thing to the motor carrier. So you probably have more knowledge about ELDs, at least I hope. The ELD rule, personal conveyance, yard miles, CSA. Big piece of this is brokers should be monitoring CSA, especially after the mandate, to see if some of their trucking company partners are getting pulled over and placed out of service for ELD related issues. Because if they are, maybe that contract they signed saying they'd have them in is a fallacy. It's a joke. It's not true. What can your broker do for you? I have a story here. My division administrator, my old boss in the state I used to work for FMCSA, happened to talk to him last week, and I said, hey man, how are you doing? He goes, what are you doing? I said, well, next week I'm going down to Austin, Texas. It's going to be hot. He goes, what are you doing down there? And I said, you wouldn't believe it. And I chuckled. You see, you wouldn't believe it. I'm going to do some ELD training that a broker asked me to do, and I'm going to present to shippers and receivers. He's like, get out of here. And I said, nope, serious. And he goes, well, you know what? It's about time. It's about time someone goes out there and talks about the coercion rule and hours of service and 30-minute breaks and the plight of the driver to these shippers and receivers. So now what I hope you do with little tab number 8 is I hope you take this information back to your companies. And I hope you think about what procedures can we put in place to increase operational efficiency, be a true partner to our motor carriers and our drivers, which won't hurt our capacity as much because we'll be a shipper of choice. What can we do to improve internally so we don't have the government come knocking our door under the coercion rule? So now when you talk about capacity, I'm going to show you a little example, right? This is just my take on capacity. If this is the number of the amount of freight that needs to be moved in the United States, right here, and it's at this level. This is a driver who has X amount of hours available using paper logs. When the ELD mandate comes and he puts an ELD in his truck, who thinks the hours available per driver are going to go up? If you think that, maybe I didn't train you good enough, but maybe you're entitled to your opinion. But ultimately, if you think it's going to go up, what I say is, if a driver is a half an hour from the shipper and he hits his 14, under the ELD, he has to stop and he's not dropping off or picking up your load till tomorrow. With a paper log, do you think a driver's going to stop at the 14th hour when he's in the same city and the shipper is literally 30 minutes up the road? Chances are he's going to drive, back his log up, still say it was 14, still say he took 10, but legitimately he didn't. With the ELD, he's not going to have that option. So that and shortchanging your 10-hour break, I think you're going to see some kind of downtick in the amount of hours available per truck, right? Hours available per truck. Now, the efficiencies in operations might go up a little bit because of asset tracking with the ELD, but overall, I'd say the number of hours available per driver in the whole United States is going to go down to some level. Now, I don't know if it's down here, up here, but down. If the economy stays the same, drivers are in a position of power. If they're in a position of power, they're going to be able to be selective as to what shipper they go to. That's why you want to accommodate them and be a shipper of choice. Now, let's say we have a mild recession and the amount of freight goes down and so does the driver hours. Well, then we probably won't see much of a difference. But what if the economy gets better, which, it's trending good? And I say the economy gets better and we see a downtick. Now it's a bigger gap. Drivers are in a position of power now. They can actually, when you talk about supply and demand, they're going to work less hours, but demand the same paycheck. I mean, they're not going to take pay cuts while everybody else is making the same amount of money. There's already a driver shortage, and if a few quit and there's already a shortage, supply and demand drivers are the low supply, right? So as a whole, that's where we are. Do you guys have any questions?
Yeah, we have a few. I guess first we can start with, what do you think this is going to do to the owner-operators, and is that going to affect some of them coming out of business?
All right, so the way I kind of addressed it just now, but I look at owner-operators, is I look at my own life. I have a resume. I have a background. Everybody on the call, you guys have a resume. You might have went to college. You might be a warehouse supervisor. I don't know what you did to get to the position you're in, but you have a skill set. I have a skill set. I'll tell you what, a driver has a skill set. My skill set is DOT compliance. My skill set is risk mitigation. I have been an investigator, compliance guy my entire life. Can I be an electrician? No. Can I be a plumber? No. Can I teach mathematics? No. Can I be a truck driver? No. because I don't have the skill set. I'd fall asleep while I'm driving. I don't have the ability to be a truck driver. So now look at the truck driver. Can he be a mathematician? Can he be a plumber? Can he be an electrician? What's he going to do if he quits, right? So the way I look at it is some guys might quit, some guys might retire, but in the end, a guy that's been driving truck 23 years and he really likes what he does and he's passionate about what he does, hey, look over here. Why would he quit? He gets to work less hours and potentially make the same amount of money after this whole thing adjusts.
Good answer. So will CSA scores dictate what carriers are being used by brokers? And is this going to take many out of the market?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Arrive Logistics and many other brokers already use CSA scores across all the violations found at roadside, not just hours of service, to vet carriers and not give freight to the carriers that have issues. Conditional rating, unsatisfactory carriers, ones that don't have authority to operate, CSA scores, it's all stuff that's vetted through. But where Arrive's taking it to the next level, which I think your broker should, is when the ELD mandate comes, or even now, you can use CSA violations. If the violation code is AOBRD or ELD related, you at least know whether they have the devices. And if they're being placed out of service at a high level, especially because they don't have them installed, that's a huge indication of people that aren't compliant come December.
This is one about how will this affect team service?
All right, so I have a funny story there. In Janesville, Wisconsin, I was an investigator and I did a roadside inspection. Pulled a truck over and the husband was driving. When I looked at the device, his wife was logged in. She was in the sleeper, he was driving. I said, dude, why is your wife logged into this while you're driving? Because he was over hours and he was in the sleeper, according to the login. And he says, she doesn't like driving through Chicago, so I drove through Chicago. Well, Janesville, Chicago is 90 miles away. There's probably 50 places to pull off and swap seats, right? And they never did it. So what do I think? I think he probably drove for her most of the time. Kind of like my wife makes me drive for me most of the time, even though she claims to be a better driver. Hey, don't tell her I said that. I don't know if we're taped, but if we are, don't ever show it to her. So.
Here's one about what do you think the potential rate increase might be due to this mandate?
All I can say is if this is the freight available and this is the amount of drivers and the driver hours availability go down, motor carriers still need to make their money. Drivers still need to make their money. So there's going to have to be some potential revenue going back to these drivers. How much? I don't know. I'm not the capacity expert. I'm not the rate expert. When you think about me, I dealt with drivers my whole life. I've dealt with trucking companies. The only time I deal with a broker in my past is to issue them penalties for not paying a motor carrier what they owed them. Other than that, I've never regulated a shipper or a receiver other than hazardous material. I've done it there. But other than that, these regulations never went over there. So ultimately, who are the experts in rates and capacity? Probably the people paying the rates and probably people that are regulating the capacity, which is the broker. So you're the subject matter experts. All I try to do is give you some education here today so you can make a more educated decision on how it would affect rates and capacity.
Are there different rules depending on the state?
Yep. So if this is the federal regulations, this little TV controller's the federal regulations, this is the state regulations, right? States can write their own regulations. The feds over here have their regulations. An example in the state of Wisconsin, Wisconsin has said, we're not going to write new rules. We're going to adopt federal law and call it state law. Now, state of Wisconsin did that almost in its entirety with a few little tweaks that they added to their own rules. But is Wisconsin adopting the ELD mandate? Yes. What are they doing in Utah? No clue. What are they doing in California? No idea. Every state is different of whether they're adopting the mandate or not. But ultimately, if you operate in intrastate commerce, it's on you to go to every state and find out through your own due diligence how each state is going to approach this.
And this is kind of related to that. How does this apply to freight being exported into Canada or Mexico?
All right, Canadians have their own hours of service. Mexicans have their own hours of service. Americans have their own hours of service. If a Canadian guy comes into the U.S., he's subject to the U.S. hours of service. If we go into Canada, we're subject to Canadian hours of service. So anybody in the U.S. at any given time has to follow our hours of service. So some vendors out there, some ELD vendors, have programmed their device to automatically recognize crossing country borders and switch you from one status to the other. Some vendors require you to push a button when you cross the border to manually switch you from 1 hours of service. Other vendors haven't even programmed their device for these other countries. So if you buy the wrong device, knowing you go to Canada sometimes, sucks to be you. You know, I don't know what to tell you.
And this last one, which I think you covered a little bit of, is I've been reading the press, this mandate may get pushed back. And what are your thoughts on how likely that is?
All right, all I can say is 1988, the federal government wrote the first rule, AOBRD. It's 2017 right now, which last time I checked is 29 years later, right? Anybody that's going to try to predict what the government's going to do when it takes 29 years to even go from that rule to this one, I can't comment on. I'll tell you this, we're only 4 months away. It takes government 29 years to go from one rule to this one. If they can get this done in 4 months to delay this thing, I'd be a little surprised, right? But I wouldn't put anything past Congress. What I find interesting is under MAP 21, it was the US Congress that was mandating FMCSA to do it, gave FMCSA a deadline that they didn't ultimately meet until a year or so later. And now that it's almost here, now the same US Congress is trying to delay something that they got involved in with MAP 21 because they felt the FMCSA wasn't acting fast enough. So it's almost ironic if you think about it that the Congress is getting involved at this late juncture.
Well, that looks like everything. Is there anything else you want to say?
What I would say is, yes, there's a lot of stuff in the news about this delay, but a delay is a delay. We need to move forward in this direction. But what I wanted you to take out of this mostly is the coercion rule. The coercion rule doesn't matter if there's a delay. And what I'm proud of everybody on the phone is you're going to take this information, I hope, I challenge you, back to your companies and make improvements. Whether the improvements are overnight or in the next few months, that's good. I'm proud of Arrive for bringing a guy like me in so I can communicate the plight of the driver to you so we can all work as a team going forward instead of pointing fingers and having problems, right? The last piece is I challenge you, if you've gotten something out of this webinar, send it out to some other people in the next day and a half, because we want this message to be sent to as many stakeholders as possible so we can improve the logistics chain. And we feel we've taken that first step with this webinar. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, John.